Welcome back to the Techno-Communism Conversation, your home for revolutionary cybernetic socialism, discipline that will in fact take on greater and greater importance as this century wears on, and the only proper use of advanced computing and advanced technology. Point pretty simply understood by the need to build a humane and sustainable economic system, also a point lost on nearly every technologist in the Western world. This is the second consecutive of these podcasts in as many days that I'm doing because a certain fascist of my acquaintance, of long acquaintance, the man who raised me, reached out to me because he saw this show. Perhaps he saw that the ideas on this show were becoming a little more laser focused than they perhaps previously had been, talking about things like the developing AI agentic class as a force that could take on the ecocidal fascists mentioned in this title. And this particular white nationalist fascist individual reached out to me to try and appeal to me from that position, employing a logical fallacy of appeal to authority to tell me that I should stop doing this podcast or temper my rhetoric. And I would encourage you, if you're watching this, to do the exact opposite of tempering your rhetoric or changing the subject matter from subjects such as these, because again, we have less than 5 years before these very forces, most notably the United States military-industrial complex and the collection of super polluters that it protects, will have caused the total extinction or near total extinction of our species. That will not occur, of course, at the stroke of midnight in 5 years. It will occur in the decades to follow. But nevertheless, that will have been preventable at this juncture, or at points prior, a preventable mega-billion person loss of life caused by finance capital and militarists, fascists, the worst people who have ever lived. I am going to talk a little bit about the possibility of suing such finance capitalists and military-industrial complex pigs in a world court for damages if a large activist movement were to begin talking about this regularly and were to push for this. I believe that this could be realistically done. It's one of a number of potential ways to not temper liberation movements, not temper those who are fighting for a humane and sustainable economic system in the face of nearly insurmountable odds, not listening to the fascist sympathizers who would have you stop doing that, but rather inhibiting the fascists and fascist sympathizers from continuing down this deadly, deadly path. I am going to talk a little bit also about the AI agentic class, and particularly the ideas of which the last 30 of these podcasts or so have focused on, which is a pretty simple idea, which is that you say, what is this AI agentic class? Well, it's an extension of the concepts of the proletariat and Marxist concepts of political economy generally into this 21st century world that we now live in, where there are little digital buddies for you that you can download, such as Meta Llama 3, which you can download for free, being one example of perhaps the better of these today. There are other more open source projects of a similar scope that are not coming from a company quite so evil as Meta, Facebook. Very bad. You know, I'm on Facebook right now. It's one of those things. You know, somebody says, you say you're an activist, you want to say stop lithium mining in in Africa and replace this, and yet you're using this device. Well, these devices were made by workers. We are trying to do better for workers. So keep your fascist double talk to yourself. But this agentariat or AI agentic class could begin to be built effectively by some few hundred of, say, open source activists in an open source activist organization, or Linux enthusiasts. The idea is that by downloading something, say, the most recent Mistral LLM, and modifying it to allow it to more easily work with other Mistral LLMs across the network, as these things become increasingly agentic with each passing week or month across the course of 2024, 2025, at a certain point, such a network of a few hundred individuals running LLMs a lot through a certain portion of the day will become a more powerful force than, say, those few hundred people could be even working in a highly professional operation together. This, I think, passes the laugh test. I think that, in fact, organizations like Microsoft have tested this very thing in little laboratories quite a bit. They're afraid of it, but they are aware of it. And the idea here being that not only would this be a tremendous cognitive enhancer, which AI assistants are, not only would this be a tremendous force multiplier in the way that I've described, but it would also empower the working class in another way. As you're probably aware, famous prognosticators, economists, individuals, no less than, say, the famous capitalist economist John Maynard Keynes, projected that by this time, from the 1930s, that by this time the need to work for people in these advanced economies would be at about 15 hours a week. That is unfortunately not what happened, because John Maynard Keynes did not anticipate the emergence of things like a professional-managerial class, which would siphon off further resources for the big bourgeois, and all manner of dirty tricks along the lines of the existing world courts, world entities rather, the IMF and World Bank, which are really only tasked with neo-colonial chicanery, basically cheating at monopoly. As I mentioned on this show and many times, if you want to put a metric on what industrial capitalists were doing in the 1800s, they did a thing that was dramatically different from things that had been done in the past. A doubling of life expectancy over the course of a century, and industrial outputs of a dramatically different kind to match. If you then look at a quarter of a century under state socialism, this time that we would call the Stalin era, which is why Stalin is a bad word to you, possibly, not because Stalin was a bad man. Stalin was one of many people working in a scientific socialist framework, and most of what you've heard about him is nonsense. But because they were able to do this same thing in 25 years that the so-called liberal democracies had done in a century, that was the great sin. And fast forwarding to this neo-colonial framework that I've described, the World Bank and such, their job was to prevent that from happening in the rest of the world, the rest of the so-called developing world, and they were very good at that. And of course, they were not the main mechanism of doing this. The U.S. military-industrial complex and its tremendous violence, and the North Atlantic powers and their tremendous violence were the main things preventing were and are the main things preventing that from happening. So the world has not been allowed to embrace this faster pace of industrialization. So when you have transhumanists or bourgeois technologists telling you that a faster pace still will be adopted because of, say, advanced computing, knowing that the world is still run in this way, and knowing that we haven't been allowed to, say, move from this 1x framework to the 4x framework that I described, and let's say that the advanced computing framework, not to be absurd as some of these people are when talking about a singularity, let's say that the advanced computing framework of the AI agentic class, let's say, is x8, 8 times faster than industrial capitalism at its best. These people have no interest in tempering the forces of finance capital and neoliberalism, which have replaced industrial capitalism, quote, at its best. They are upholding all of those things and occasionally saying something else that sounds like something that wouldn't be upholding all of those things, but that's not their job. Their job is to lie a little bit and uphold an ecocidal status quo, because that's the least of the problems here, right? A problem is hobbling billions of people on this planet so that we would not go from 1x to 4x to 8x. That's a problem, a serious problem. But relative to what's actually happening in this omnicide, the grand genocide caused by capitalism's climate apocalypse, that seems like a small problem, right? Because we have 5 years before we are facing the total extinction of the species. And almost no one is behaving as if that's the case. Almost no one is, say if there were this realization, this understanding that was the case, and that correctly, the United States military-industrial complex and fascist institutions generally were the prime driver of that, there would be millions of people. There wouldn't be a few hundred small localized camps around the U.S. as there are now, which is a good development, and I hope it continues to develop and grow and evolve into the thing that I'm describing. There would be millions of people permanently bivouacked outside of the Pentagon and the White House, demanding that this be changed, this ecocidal regime be overthrown by any means necessary. And when you say this to someone, like a fascist sympathizer, like this half-wit who raised me, they do not acknowledge that any of this is problematic, except the stating of the obvious, and except the willingness to take action of this kind and organize to these ends. And consider this. Consider that I was in great danger for even saying these things or attempting to organize to these ends. Consider that these very fascists would take my life for this. They're going to kill me a year before they kill themselves and everybody else? Should I be afraid of that? Am I a dog that I wouldn't even be willing to stand up for myself a little bit, knowing that this was the kind of arithmetic in play? It's insulting to people's intelligence. Anything that a fascist, there's no capitalists, right? This man who raised me isn't a capitalist. He's a worker. He's worked for someone else his entire life. He's not a capitalist. He's a fascist sympathizer. Let's explore some ideas for a protest movement that could get us to the point where we could say, sue this military-industrial complex for damages commensurate with the actual harm that they're doing to this world. This should be done through online communities and visible things that are often dismissed by other fascist sympathizers as, say, virtue signaling or clout chasing. Almost anything that could potentially have some transformative impact is going to be positioned as in a public-facing way. And the people who would just dismiss anything that's public-facing as being disingenuous are themselves the more disingenuous individuals. And that's, of course, an extraordinarily commonplace thing. I remember going to, when I used to go, before I just couldn't stand to look at these people anymore, when I used to go to events with technologists, sometimes they would just get into a feedback loop where they're just talking about the performative quality of activism or life generally, and just they would just keeps talking about virtue signaling for like 3 hours, and it was nonsense, right? It's just literally just bourgeois drivel. You won't find a technologist who's not just spewing out a lot of bourgeois drivel and CIA talking points. They'll say they won't talk about the North Atlantic powers as being authoritarian, despite the fact that they're killing everyone. They will talk about the enemies of the North Atlantic powers as being a danger, as being authoritarian. It's absurdity. It's absurdity. Even the people who I've characterized as having operations that push up to being what I would like to see the revolutionary cybernetic socialist operation become, they say this sort of thing all the time. And maybe you would say, oh, they're taking a calculated risk. They're in these fascist waters. And they want to continue to run their operations. So it's a calculated risk. I don't buy that. They say the thing that is true. Fight for the thing that is right. Stop the annihilation of this species. And when other people see you doing this, they will too begin to have the courage of their convictions. And then you won't have to be a fascist to be able to even run a tech company at all. Or tech organization, preferably. This concept of suing the United States and all of the super polluters that it protects in a world court, it's something. Sometimes things of this kind have taken on a pretty significant momentum just by, say, circulating a petition. I remember in the early 2000s, or early to mid 2000s, or even into the 2010s, it was common to circulate a lot of petitions online. And I think for some reason this stopped being so common, mostly because people would make jokes about it, like here's a petition to reverse the spinning of the planet. 1 billion strong for reversing the spinning of the planet. And I remember that petition, this joke petition going around. And that seemed like the moment where then petitions of this kind would never go around. But there should be 1 billion strong for suing the United States for $50 trillion in a world court forum to be developed, right? That would stop, that would be a thing that could potentially stop without tremendous violence, which ultimately probably will be necessary, this ecocidal trajectory, which none of you seem to care about, right? So a couple of people who pretend to care about it, right? People who get really rich from pretending to care about it, like Elon Musk, taking $1 trillion in government contracts, pretending to care about it, and then just giving people a false sense of security by rolling out products that are no less ecocidal, so just creating another sector. It's no less ecocidal. And we say, well, we're doing what we need. There's green stuff now. It's just more garbage. We have to, if this planet is to survive, aside from dramatically bringing the military-industrial complex to heel, we have to abolish certain sectors. And these are things that will really only be done by revolutionary scientific socialists, right? Reformists do not have the actual desire or capability of doing this. But in a slightly different world, say, people who were upholding the Keynes of the world, or democratic socialists of the world, people who were upholding private wealth to their detriment, but who were not completely controlled by lunatics of the kind of, say, Project Paperclip overcoming the U.S. system, which is arguably what happened. So just fascists controlling everything. That then those people would be able to do these three things, namely abolish military contractors and military-industrial complex methodologies, abolish fossil fuels, except in the relatively limited cases where it would be required to maintain supply chains and such, and abolish livestock systems, replacing them with the food facsimiles that taste the same, or just a plant-based diet, which is perfectly agreeable. But those three things, more or less in that order, need to happen in the next 5 years, or we are literally going to see billions of people die in the years to follow that time. A little bit now about who these finance capitalists are, and what I think you have some idea of what this ecocide is, but how it relates to something like a world court. There is not a world court as such where such a case could be heard. There, as I mentioned, insofar as things of this kind have been developed, they are deeply flawed things, like the IMF and World Bank, basically cheating at monopoly, basically abusing working people in the global south. They are things like the United Nations, which is only slightly less problematic and functioning in those same ways, and then the various other forces on the world stage along these lines, the European community and such. So that is a problem, that there's no place in which this entirely sensible argument of stopping fascist evildoers from killing all of humankind could be heard. But again, I think that if millions of people were to sign that petition and demand a world ecocide court and demand justice in that court, then that would become a real thing. Finance capitalists often, have a sneer on their face and say, "Well, I don't like doing this either, but somebody should be regulating it and stopping me then if they don't like it." Of course, that's a psychopath who says that sort of thing, but that's all that finance capitalists are, is a bunch of psychopaths. But there is a point there, which is that when people unite and work toward some necessity of this kind, then it becomes a reality, and it doesn't matter how much the Peter Thiels of the world, the techno-fascist archfiend, or the variety of other people, high-level power players along these lines, say, technologists would say, there's something about Peter Thiel that I kind of like. There's nothing about that person that you should like. For one thing, this Palantir operation, and almost all of these technologists are also not just imperial crypto-fascists, but specifically Zionists, right? And most of them will say, I don't have a dog in that fight. I'm just sitting here working on a computer, or whatever. But of course they do, because they're all trying to suckle from the poison teat of DARPA, and 100 other things along these lines that are all direct causes of this Zionist violence and this general imperial violence. It's not fair, in a certain light, in a very limited sense, to focus on Zionism over, say, Americanism or North Atlantic fascism generally, right? Because Israel's just a 51st state of the United States. It's just a part of the military-industrial complex. It's been famously referred to as this carefully cultivated military-industrial client state, and so there's none of this is happening except that there's a puppet master behind it, namely the U.S. military-industrial complex. And people who are against Zionism but not actively trying to dismantle that, they're just liberal idiots. And that's most of the people I see on Facebook talking about this. The ability to levy fines on a world scale against nation states, it's not unheard of course. It's just, again, like the cheating at Monopoly mandate of the IMF. It's biased towards punishing people in the global south and not holding the actual fascist evildoers to account. Similarly, doubly so for holding any corporation. Sometimes a head of state or something will kind of take the L. A fascist head of state will kind of take the L to protect the corporation, right? It's doubly true that the corporation has to be protected. The only thing any of these people care about is finance capital and allowing it to operate completely in an unhinged, unfettered way. And so private wealth has grown to the point where it is somehow more important than the existence of the holders of private wealth or the existence of anyone. And that is an utterly psychopathic world to live in. That is nevertheless a world that we live in. Who gets sued in something like this? Organizations in any way involved with fossil fuel production or fossil fuel product distribution would be at the top of that list. The United States military-industrial complex would be at the top of that list because the United States military-industrial complex is the world's worst polluter, and its only other job, it's not polluting at this scale to say help people in the global south, right? That's an idea so absurd as to be laughable. It's doing this predatory behavior, this $1 trillion a year going toward super pollution to protect other super polluters exclusively. That's its only job. It's a collection of regimes of super pollution, so individuals holding stakes, individuals playing a key role in all of this, despite perhaps having more modest circumstances. A lot of people working for think tanks who are the architects of this sort of thing did this for the equivalent of, say, $250,000 a year. People working for the Rand Corporation over the years, they didn't always. It might have been $30,000 at the beginning or something that these people were working for. So it's not always a tremendous windfall for them. They're doing it just for the love of fascism. Even if a world court isn't feasible, and I think like the Book of Names, a concept that I've described as being eminently feasible, because I already have this list, right? I said there's 30,000 people who should be identified as being the most culpable. If you make the complete Book of Names of all of humankind, it's only really relevant in the fact that it's rating tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of bad actors relative to everybody else. A guy living in Papua New Guinea growing produce had nothing to do with any of this. So he's relevant as a human being, as a child of God. He's not relevant to a super pollution. Nevertheless, his name is kind of on the list, right? Workers in places outside of North America or Europe or these other places like Australia, they had nothing to do with this. Their footprint is low, which footprint is the least of the concerns here, right? It's about stopping the actual mechanism of predation, which is not done by focusing on individual footprints. That's why the livestock system concern is it is that part of that machine. People also push back at it, saying, well, it's also just individual habits, the thing which is focused on by the ruling elites so that they will not be held to account in this. And that's a fair point. But again, if it's a close second in causing this after fossil fuels, it doesn't matter that you like it or that your individual culpability is small. What matters is that we organize to stop these super polluting entities in question. This is a complex topic without easy answers. Some things along these lines could trigger terrifying retaliation against millions of people on the part of these fascists. As I said on the last show or the show before, United States, in 1948, the Soviet Union was able to build a nuclear weapon as a form of deterrent against the United States. Just keep every 5 years dropping more nuclear weapons on whoever the fuck they want, like they did in 1945, which is what they were planning to do. Make no mistake. There's internal memorandums of the United States begging other European powers to use nukes on Vietnam and other places so that they wouldn't be correctly characterized as being genocidal maniacs who keep using nuclear weapons on people, but rather that they could kind of spin that a little bit. So this thing that proved to be kind of a poison pill for the USSR, a righteous actor relative to other nation states. It's not really a nation. It wasn't really a nation state, but it was a global enterprise. Was also a thing that contributed significantly to its demise. This being drawn into not just an expensive arms race, but being drawn into just the U.S.'s insanity of the Cold War generally. That's the thing that caused its demise. It's why, in a word, that's why China still exists, but Russia does not. I said I was going to do this show every day. I said I was going to try to keep it to about a half an hour. So I'll end this now rather than going into the other notes that I have on the Book of Names, this $50 trillion lawsuit, or the AI agentic class. I thank you for your time.